In the year 600 AD, the Arabian Peninsula was not the center of anything. It had no superpower status, no global empire, no massive cities like Rome or Constantinople. It was tribal, fragmented, competitive. Trade caravans moved through it, but power did not. Within 1 century, that changes. By 750 AD, armies inspired by a new religious movement controlled territories stretching from Spain to Central Asia. They governed former Roman provinces, defeated Persian imperial forces, and built a political structure that would shape law, language, architecture, trade, and science across 3 continents. That transformation did not happen gradually. It happened fast. This is a rise of Islam, not just as a religion, but as a civilization-building force. If you want history where ideas turn into empires, subscribe, because this one moves at desert speed. Before Islam, Arabia was politically decentralized. Loyalty was tribal. Honor, lineage, and alliances defined survival. Mecca was already a significant trade hub, positioned along caravan routes connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. The Kaaba stood in Mecca as a sacred site, housing numerous tribal idols. Religion was diverse. Polytheism dominated, but Jewish and Christian communities existed across the peninsula, especially in the north and south. There was trade wealth, but no unified state, no centralized law, no single authority binding the tribes. That vacuum mattered. In 610 AD, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, a merchant from Mecca, began receiving revelations which Muslims believed to be from God. These revelations would later be compiled into the Quran. His message emphasized monotheism, moral accountability, social justice, and rejection of tribal idol worship. The reaction in Mecca was not enthusiastic. The Quraysh elite saw the new message as a threat, economically and socially. A monotheistic message that rejected idols directly challenged the religious economy surrounding the Kaaba. Persecution followed. In 622 AD, Muhammad and his followers migrated to Yathrib, later known as Medina. This migration, the Hijra, marks year 1 in the Islamic calendar. In Medina, something critical happened. The movement became political. Muhammad was not only a religious leader, he became a statesman, judge, and military commander. Tribal factions were unified under a shared legal and religious framework known as the Constitution of Medina. For the first time, loyalty extended beyond bloodline. It extended to belief. That shift from tribe to community created cohesion. Over the next decade, conflict between Mecca and Medina intensified. Battles such as Badr, 624, Uhud, 625, and the Trench, 627, tested the survival of the early Muslim community. In 630 AD, Muhammad and his followers entered Mecca largely without large-scale destruction. The Kaaba was rededicated to monotheistic worship. Within 2 years, most of the Arabian Peninsula had pledged allegiance. When Muhammad died in 632 AD, Arabia was unified under a religious political structure that did not previously exist. But unity was fragile, and expansion would define survival. After Muhammad's death, leadership passed to caliphs, beginning with Abu Bakr, then Umar, Uthman, and Ali. These first decades were decisive. The Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire had just exhausted themselves fighting each other in long, destructive wars. Their borders were stretched thin, their armies depleted. Arab Muslim forces moved rapidly. By 636 AD, they defeated Byzantine forces at Yarmouk. Shortly after, they overcame Persian armies at Al-Qadisiyah. Within a generation, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Persia, all shifted under Muslim control. This wasn't random raiding. It became administrative governance. Cities like Damascus and later Kufa became political centers. Local populations, many of whom were Christian, Jewish, or Zoroastrian, were incorporated into a new imperial structure. Tax systems were formalized. Administrative continuity was often maintained. Arabic gradually became a governing language. In less than 30 years, the map changed dramatically. In 661 AD, the Islamic world emerged from its first major internal crisis, the First Fitna, a civil war that followed the assassination of the fourth caliph, Ali ibn Abi Talib. The conflict revealed something important. The rapidly expanding Muslim community now controlled vast territory, and governing it required more than tribal consensus. Power eventually consolidated under Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, a skilled political operator and governor of Syria. He established the Umayyad dynasty and moved the political capital to Damascus, a city that had once been a Roman administrative center and still possessed the infrastructure of imperial governance. This shift marked a turning point. The early caliphate had been a rapidly expanding political religious movement centered in Arabia. Under the Umayyads, it transformed into a fully functioning empire. Damascus became the nerve center of a government managing lands that stretched across 3 continents. From there, governors were appointed to oversee provinces. Tax systems were standardized, and administrative practices inherited from Byzantine and Persian bureaucracies were adapted to the new order. Expansion did not slow down. In North Africa, Muslim forces pushed steadily westward, gradually overcoming Byzantine resistance and integrating Berber populations into the expanding political system. By the early 8th century, Muslim armies reached the Atlantic coast. Then, in 711 AD, a force led by Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the narrow strait separating North Africa from the Iberian Peninsula. Within a few years, most of the Visigothic kingdom collapsed, and Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, was established. Cities like Cordoba and Toledo became part of a political network that stretched back to Damascus. At the same time, Umayyad armies moved eastward. They secured large portions of Central Asia, incorporating cities along the Silk Road. In the east, Muslim forces reached the Indus Valley, bringing parts of the Indian subcontinent into the orbit of the expanding caliphate. By the early 8th century, the Umayyad Caliphate controlled territory from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of China. It was one of the largest political entities the world had ever seen. But holding an empire together required more than conquest. The Umayyads began building imperial systems. Arabic gradually replaced Greek and Persian as the administrative language across much of the empire. This linguistic shift unified bureaucratic communication across distant provinces. Coinage was standardized, replacing Byzantine and Persian currency with coins carrying Arabic inscriptions. Tax structures were refined, balancing revenue extraction with political stability. Roads and communication networks connected provincial centers to Damascus. Trade flourished under the stability. Caravans moved between cities from North Africa to Central Asia, carrying goods, ideas, and technologies. This was no longer tribal expansion driven by battlefield victories. It was imperial governance. But scale brings tension. As the empire grew, new populations entered the Islamic world. Many converts were non-Arabs, Persians, Berbers, Central Asians. In theory, Islam emphasized equality among believers. In practice, the Umayyad administration often favored Arab elites in taxation and political influence. These disparities created resentment. Religious scholars criticized the dynasty for becoming too worldly. Non-Arab converts questioned unequal treatment. Rival factions within the ruling elite maneuvered for power. The empire remained vast and wealthy, but beneath the surface, political pressure accumulated. By the mid-8th century, opposition coalesced around a movement that claimed to represent a more legitimate leadership line, descending from the Prophet's family. In 750 AD, that movement, the Abbasid Revolution, swept across the eastern provinces. Umayyad armies were defeated, and the dynasty that had ruled one of history's largest empires collapsed. A new dynasty would take its place. And under the Abbasids, the center of the Islamic world would move again, this time to Baghdad, where power would become not just political, but intellectual. The Abbasids moved the capital to Baghdad in 762 AD. Baghdad was not just a political capital. It became an intellectual engine. The Islamic Golden Age flourished between the 8th and 13th centuries. Scholars translated Greek philosophical texts. Advances were made in algebra, medicine, astronomy, chemistry, and engineering. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad symbolized this era, a center of translation and scholarship drawing knowledge from Persian, Greek, Indian, and other traditions. Trade networks connected China to the Mediterranean. Paper manufacturing spread westward. Banking instruments and credit systems developed. Islamic civilization during this period was not isolated. It was connected commercially and intellectually. But political unity fragmented over time. Regional dynasties emerged. Authority decentralized. By the middle of the 13th century, the Abbasid Caliphate was no longer the unstoppable empire it once had been. Baghdad was still magnificent. Libraries filled with centuries of scholarship, markets crowded with merchants from Persia, India, and the Mediterranean, canals feeding fertile farmland along the Tigris River. But politically, the caliphate had weakened. Regional dynasties governed large parts of the Islamic world independently. Military power had shifted away from Baghdad. The city remained culturally brilliant, but strategically exposed. Then the Mongols arrived. The Mongol Empire, forged by Genghis Khan, had already swept across Central Asia like a storm system that never lost momentum. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Entire populations disappeared. Walls that had stood for centuries collapsed under Mongol siege tactics and relentless cavalry assaults. By the 1250s, the Mongol advance had reached the borders of the Islamic heartlands. In 1258, Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, marched toward Baghdad with an army that had already crushed kingdoms across Persia. The Abbasid Caliph believed negotiation might spare the city. He was wrong. The Mongols surrounded Baghdad and began the siege. Within weeks, the defenses collapsed. What followed became one of the most devastating sackings in medieval history. The city that had once been the intellectual center of the world was overwhelmed. Libraries were destroyed, scholars killed, palaces looted. The famed canals that irrigated Mesopotamia for centuries were damaged, contributing to long-term agricultural decline. Some chroniclers wrote that the waters of the Tigris ran black with ink from destroyed books. Whether exaggerated or not, the symbolism was clear. The political heart of the Islamic world had fallen. The Abbasid Caliph was executed. The Caliphate, which had ruled for 5 centuries, was finished. For a moment, it seemed like the civilization built over centuries might collapse entirely. But it didn't. Islam had spread too far, across too many regions, among too many cultures. Instead of disappearing, power shifted. In Anatolia, frontier warriors would soon build a new state that grew into the Ottoman Empire. In Persia, the Safavid dynasty would reshape regional politics and religious identity. In South Asia, the Mughal Empire would rise, ruling vast populations and building cities that rivaled the greatest capitals of the age. By the 16th century, these Islamic empires controlled enormous territory across 3 continents. The political center had moved, but the civilization endured. The Ottomans in particular would become one of the longest-lasting imperial powers in world history, ruling from Istanbul and controlling key trade routes between Europe and Asia. Their empire would survive until the aftermath of World War I, nearly 7 centuries after the fall of Baghdad. The Mongols had destroyed a capital, but they had not erased the civilization. The rise of Islam was not only military expansion, it was institutional creation. Law, language, trade routes, architecture, scientific preservation, and development. Within a century, a regional religious movement reshaped global political geography. Within a few centuries, it became one of the central pillars of world civilization. Its influence remains visible today in legal systems, language, culture, and geopolitics. This story is not one of sudden domination. It is one of cohesion, momentum, and adaptation. If you want the next chapter, the Crusades and the collision between Islamic and European powers, subscribe, because that story reshapes both worlds.